let's see how it goes. Okay, right, so basically I've been playing with IP induced polarization effects in airborne data for quite a bit, and I see it everywhere, and I'll share with you my view on it. Let's get going. I guess the new thing that I'm going to show today is something we recently came up with, which is called the airborne IP scanner, which is a way to robustly assess your data and know, hopefully correctly, where your data is affected by IP, and hence you should worry about it, or where it's not. Okay, let's start with some semantics about IP. IP stands for induced polarization. It's usually referred to in exploration world to ground or a galvanic method, but nonetheless, from a physical perspective, it describes something that has got a frequency-dependent resistivity associated to it, and that's basically also what happens in the EM, airborne EM. So even though it happens at different frequencies, it still is a frequency-dependent resistivity process that takes place. So with that background, I think it is correct to adequate to call it airborne IP. But nonetheless, bear in mind, it's not the same as ground IP. Frequencies are vastly different. So it does take place at frequencies much higher than in ground. It doesn't give the same information about subsurface than the ground does, but it can be complementary to it. And it's likely associated to sources which are different from those that produce ground IP anomalies, but as I said, it can complement it. Okay, IP effects are very widespread in airborne EM data, at least in those that I get to see. From all over the world, different systems have a lot of it. And once you have IP effects in the data, it's your choice whether they represent an opportunity or a problem. It's always either or. There is no such a thing as it will be indifferent. It is either or, and it depends how you deal with them. Where present, the IP effects need to be taken into account in the modeling in order to get the correct resistivities or conductivities and also the chargeabilities. However, airborne IP processing and modeling is currently expensive, and it can actually be counterproductive if you do it where you shouldn't. So if you model IP where there is no measurable IP signaling in the airborne EM data, you're shooting yourself in the foot. So we need a tool to identify where airborne IP is present in the data, and it is a subject of this talk, and we call it the airborne IP scanner. So the evidence is that when you have a central loop EM system and you see something like this that changes sign in the lag time, this is a log scale, so you see positive, but in reality it's the absolute value of the log of the voltages, so it actually wraps up the negative. So when you see something like that, a sign change, you need to call upon a frequency-dependent resistivity to explain it. Now, the catch is that the transient may very well never change sign and still IP can be present. For example, if this transient here, we had a hit noise earlier, we would never see a sign change. Nonetheless, the transient would have already been affected and distorted by the presence of IP. This is another example where you never see a sign change. The whole thing is positive all the time. Nonetheless, you've got IP effects in there. And the bottom right, never changes sign. It starts and finishes negative, and this is still IP in there. So I'll show you a little bit more with synthetics, using something synthetics, how these things can happen. But for the moment, you have to trust me. Again, what can airborne IP be applied to in terms of exploration? This is one Jim McNay's favorite slides. He's basically saying that, you know, you're never gonna excite a massive sulfide with an airborne EM system in terms of chargeability, and he's right. I'm not going to argue against that because we're using very high frequencies compared to ground IP. Nonetheless, I think we are exciting something which may be around or above mineralization, and at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what we're exciting, because the moment you have an IP effect into the data, the transient is distorted, and if you don't model it right, your conductivities will be wrong. But definitely we need a lot of work to really understand, get to the bottom of what is an airborne IP signal mainly associated to, but we can't ignore it. So these are all examples of IP effects I've seen over the years, and many more. This is a little bit updated. All of these are IP effects on real data. You've got the double sign change, and I'll show you how that can happen. You've got Vitam, Xcite, equator, elephant, Vitam, etc. Now, if you don't model IP, the only thing you can do is take away the negatives and invert it with a standard code that uses non-dispersive resistivities, and you still get the wrong answer. So, because in reality, by taking the negatives out, you haven't gotten rid of the IP effects completely. And I'll show you why that is. So, I'm not going to bore you too much with the physics, but it's important to realize a couple of things. So, obviously, I haven't come up with this. We're standing on the shoulder of giants that saw this since the 80s. And they realized back then that, you know, when you got something chargeable in the ground, you have a superposition of effect in the receiver of the standard eddy current and the IP current. And how much of that you see, it all depends on the balance between the two. Now, what they failed to recognize back then, in my view, was the extraordinary effect of layering of resistivity onto what you measure. And it's also understandable back then, you know, computers weren't that powerful. So lots of the conclusions they came to in the late 80s were based on half space homogeneous models. Whereas if you actually whack a resistive basement below something conductive and chargeable, that will make your measurable IP effect in the airborne EM data explode. And I'll show you what that is. Well, basically, the whole very simple concept is that what you measure in the receiver is the summation of the secondary field that comes from the eddy currents and from the IP currents. And you will see the IP effect, a measurable IP effect, only if the contribution of the IP currents is as strong or stronger than the one of the eddy currents. Now, obviously, if you put a resistor below a conductive chargeable layer, the relative contribution of the eddy currents will decrease suddenly, and which will make the IP effects much more visible. The other thing which really struck me when it finally became clear in my head is that the moment you have a measurable IP signal in the data, your diffusion depth relationship doesn't hold anymore. So I repeat, the relationship between voltage, time, and depth doesn't hold anymore. And this is mind-blowing it was for me at least. Okay. I'll talk about the effect of layering. All these other things can be discussed. It will take a whole week, but we can take questions if you have at the end. If you have any special point that out of this you would like to discuss. But I need to go by the effect of layering because it's really central in what this whole thing is about. So I'm going to show you a number of forward responses, and this is forward response of a Vitam-like system. For homogeneous subspaces, the only difference between these two forward responses is that in one case the half space is non-chargeable, in the other case it's chargeable. So it's always 100 meters, but in one case it's 0 millivolts or 0 M, and in the other case it's 300 millivolts, or if you rather use the M notion, then it will be a 0.3. And you can see that even though you don't have a sign change, you already have a very strong distortion of the transient if you do have IP. Now, what I'm going to do next in the next slide, I'm not going to change the amount of chargeable stuff. The only thing I'm going to do, I'm going to put a resistor below this first chargeable layer, and this is what happens. So the only chargeable stuff is still in the near surface, 50 meters of 100 meters and 300 millivolts volt. 1 millisiemens is the time constant of the cold model, and 0.5 is the frequency parameter of the cold. And then you have a resistor below. And then all of a sudden you have strong negatives developing here. These are negatives. So this is immediately shows, I think, quite convincingly what I discussed earlier. Now, why all of a sudden the AP effect becomes so much more visible now? Because you basically take away any chance for eddy currents to develop from a certain time onwards, because there's nothing that conduces current. So all you're left with in terms of contribution at the receiver is the contribution of the IP currents that still come from the surface. Some more synthetics because they are very important. So this is a mock-up of the diffusion path of the eddy currents and the IP currents. It's not meant to be accurate in any ways, it's just qualitative. But basically shows in different views your standard patterns of the eddy currents and of the IP currents. Now, this is a very simple two-layer model where you have a conductive chargeable first layer and a non-chargeable resistive bedrock. You can read the parameters in here. Now, what I'm going to show you now, and why do the IP currents only sit in the near surface? Because that's the only thing that's chargeable. They can't travel down into something that's not chargeable. So what I'll show you now is this sets of panels where I have the B field response. Now, keep in mind that currents are directly associated with B fields, not the BDT. You know, when we normally look at EM data in voltage, there is the BDT. In reality, if you want to link it directly with time to the path of the currents, we should be looking at B field. So, B field, on the left-hand side, you have what you would have recorded in total absence of chargeability in the first place. In the middle, which is your standard eddy currents contribution, in the middle you have the contribution of the IP currents only. All of them are negative, so all of them go against the EM currents. And on the right-hand side is what you actually measure. So this is what the receiver measures, and it's given by the summation of the contribution of the standard EM fields and the IP, standard EM current and the IP current. And yeah, and so you can see it starts positive and then it goes negative. As I said, what we normally record and look at is the BDT. In the BDT, the same thing will look like that. And just a comment, maybe obvious to some of you, but the moment that one sees a sign change in the transient, that's not the time that the overall current changes sign. That's actually the time where the overall current reaches a maximum in the opposite direction. Nonetheless, qualitatively tells the same story, which basically only at the beginning we have information that comes from both the IP and the EM, but then from about this time onward, all you record only comes from the IP current, which is always ever in the near surface. So, as I said earlier, the entire transient is trapped in the near surface, which is what we call the airborne IP trap. This was published a few months ago with Chris Wines. Now, does that mean that one can only recover chargeability from the near surface? No, because all you have to do is bury this conductive and chargeable layer below something resistive, and sandwich it between a resistive cover and a resistive bedrock, and you will get exactly the same thing, only a little bit later in time. So in this case, you will have, again, this trap. So the entire transient, most of the transient will be trapped in terms of where the information comes from in this second layer, which is conductive and chargeable at depth. And I'll show you later examples where we reliably recovered the chargeability down to 150 meters.
Andrea, sorry to interrupt. There's been a request. Could you try and use the laser pointer instead of the mouse just to make it a bit clearer?
And you had already told me that, and I forgot. Sorry.
It's okay. I forgot to remind you. Okay, there you are. Thank you.
Thanks. Sorry, guys. Okay, so I'll keep it here on the bottom, and then when needed, I'll use it. Okay, right. Some more examples because I think it's very important. Now, the thing that changed with respect to the previous one is that now I added a conductor at depth. Now, very often you fly airborne to look for bedrock conductors in exploration. And I'm going to show you what happens to your bedrock conductor in presence of something shallow and chargeable if you don't account for it. So I'm going to show you a set of slides as I will progress through them. The only thing that changes is the depth at which this conductive basement is buried. So we start with it very deep, and then I'm going to bring it shallower and shallower and shallower. Again, B field in the top, DBDT in the bottom. And again, on the left-hand side is what you would have measured in total absence of chargeability, anything chargeable anywhere. In the middle is the contribution of the chargeability current that comes from the IP current only. And on the right-hand side is what you actually measure. Okay, so when you have a conductor so deep, you're not going to see it, not with a 25 Hertz system above noise level. And rightly so, you don't see it. So again, field dots are positive and open squares are negative. Now I'm going to start putting these shallower and shallower and shallower. Keep your eyes on the right-hand side and see what happens to the recorded DBDT or B field, depending whether you're a B field person or DBDT. Have a look at those. So I'm going to leave the pointer there. And I'm going to start bringing the conductor closer and closer to surface. Now you can already see some changes, some measurable changes above noise level. And in here already, your B field has already gone back to positive. Why is that? Because at this point of time, the receiver has already started sensing the effect of the eddy currents at depth, which are starting to overpower the IP, the contribution from the IP currents which were at surface. So all of a sudden, if you think about the fusion depth, we basically jump from, say, here up to, say, this time, and then bang, we jump very, very late in time to the conductive basement. I'm going to continue bringing this closer and closer to surface. Now you have a sign change again in the DBDT, and this is a double sign change that I showed you earlier on the real data. I've got another example further down. This stuff is real. Okay, then you have this beautiful double sign changes. Now, if we are at 400 meters, this is well within depth of investigation of a VTEM-like system, and this is how your transit will look like in absence of IP. This is how it looks like in presence of IP associated with something chargeable. Of course, lots of people use the tau maps from contractors to try to look for the basement conductors. Just think about, what would your tau map look like here, and with respect to what it should look like in terms of the amount of conductance and depth of this conductor. Obviously, the tau map in here will give you a very wrong feel for how much conductance there really is at depth. Keep doing that. And now we're in a situation where you can hardly see the double sign change. And then as I bring it closer and closer, at this here, in this scenario here, basically you hardly see the effect of IP in the transit anymore, because the effect of the EM currents from depth are overpowering the IP in there. It doesn't mean that it's not there anymore. It's still there, but it's just orders of magnitude smaller now than the contribution coming from the standard EM response. Now this actually happens on real data too. I'll show you some examples. So in the top here, this is an example from the Hammersley in the Pilbara in Australia. So in the top, you see the resistivities you would have obtained if you didn't model IP on Xcite data in a place that didn't have IP. And basically you end up with this broken conductors at depth, which could very well represent an interesting exploration target, but they're wrong. What that conductivity model should look like is like this, because this is the conductivity that you obtain if you keep the negatives, you model them, and you solve at the same time for conductivity and chargeability. Basically, these are bits, and under these hills, they are very chargeable, so they affect everything down to depth. Now, if you do model chargeability, you actually recover these almost horizontal layers, which are the shales. So this is a geological target rather than an isolated bedrock conductor. So a very big difference from an exploration standpoint. Another example, this is an example from Vitam from the Colorado work we're doing with USGS. In here, you've got beautiful double sign changes, and I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that in here, we are seeing both measured data, which are the error bars, and forward model data, which are the continuous line. You can hardly see them. You can probably see that there a little bit. And we're actually fitting this double sign change beautifully in places there. In other places, we're fitting very nicely these curves, which, although never change sign, you can never fit if you don't call upon a frequency-dependent resistivity. And why do we have this? Because we got something chargeable at surface and then something conductive at depth. So without the IP modeling, what could have never recovered this Mancos shale and Morrison shales at depth, simply because they're sitting below very distorted transit. Another example from the same place, this is just to show you how chargeability can be useful in terms of integrating with resistivity in terms of interpretation. So chargeability, resistivity, and we actually are tracking chargeability down to 150 meters or so. And it's quite interesting to see here in the near surface, we've got a resistive layer, but it actually almost homogeneous in terms of resistivity, but you can actually see layering within the chargeability, which does allow for a more advanced interpretation of that color. Another example very relevant towards exploration. So on the top is the resistivity. This is from Kazakhstan, Xcite data. If you don't model IP, you end up with a resistivity that looks like that. So you end up with, again, an isolated bedrock conductor, which may look something you want to drill. In reality, it's wrong, it's an artifact. This is how the resistivity will look like if you did measure it, if you did model IP, because chargeability looks like that. So again, it's always, keep in mind, it's always the interplay between the contribution of the IP effects and the contribution of the standard eddy currents that determine how your transit looks like, which also determines the type of artifacts you will obtain in your model if you invert that transit without modeling IP. Another example, typical example, this is resistivity you would obtain if you didn't model IP. And let me just point you to this wiggly line, black wiggly line. This is data misfit. If you're lucky, you will see a high misfit if there was IP and you didn't model it. And this is why this often goes up. But in terms of basement, you tend to see these dike-like structures coming out from the center of the Earth and coming very close to the surface. And you also tend to see a very conductive, very shallow cover in there. This is if you don't model IP. If you do model IP, the resistivities look like that. We are fitting the data as opposed to not, and the chargeabilities look like that. Again, it was the effect of something moderately conductive and chargeable, relatively shallow, that created a very strong distortion of the transient that then later created the artifact if IP was not dealt with properly. And again, we're fitting the data very well. So, summarizing what happens if you don't model IP once it's in the data, the bedrock conductors you are after may disappear, or you may get many isolated promising anomalies which are artifacts at depth. You may underestimate thickness of conductive chargeable layers severely and overestimate their conductivity. You may severely underestimate depth debasement and its conductivity. And that if your exploration is based upon any sort of geological model, it's going to be skewed in any sort of way in terms of absolute values of physical properties, in terms of geometry, yeah, everything. And on top of it, you actually throw away a free extra parameter, i.e. the chargeability, which may actually be pretty useful for your interpret. So hopefully I have convinced you by now that once IP is in the data, you actually need to take it into account in your processing and modeling. So there is a lot of it in the data worldwide, as I said, and we have developed a scanning methodology that that's based on a combination of in-depth analysis of the data space and limited analysis in the model space that we think is robust and can give you a map of where IP is present in the data. We call this the airborne IP scanner. It's basically a ternary map. This is surely IP, surely no IP, likely IP in the area. Okay, the workflow is a bit tedious if explained in words. I'm gonna go on to the next slide that shows it in terms of with some workflow graphics. Basically, we start with the data. So we take the data, we decimate it, we assess and eliminate the noise level because we only want to do the scanner on legit voltages above noise level. Then we run synthetic modeling on using the exact specs of the system that was used in that survey to define the boundaries of slopes and transients that can be associated with non-IP Earth. And we use that later when we compare it against, for example, different towers that we produce on the real data. So then we run individual IP metrics, which can be divided into metrics on negatives, on decay rates. So the rates of decay, the towers that we talked about earlier. Then we select a few lines to be modeled without IP. We select these lines, we model them without IP, and then the core of it is an optimization routine that determines the best combination of different metrics that predicting non-IP misfits and their coefficients. Basically, at the bottom of it, you have the belief, which we believe is correct, that once you describe and model your system correctly, and once you take possible 3 effects out of the equation, if you can't fit the data and you have very fast decays, it's because you have IP in there. So that's really in the gut of this. So we apply the result of this optimization to derive a map of the airborne IP scanner, and then we compare that value of the IP scanner against selected inverted IP modeling to compare it against the chargeability that one does get if one models the IP correctly. And we have a look at how they compare. If they look okay in the sense that a high IP scanner value is actually associated with a high chargeability once inverted, then we think we say, okay, we got it right. If that doesn't compare well, probably we haven't assigned the right noise levels. So we go back here and we iterate. It normally takes 2 or 3 iterations to get it right. Now I'm going to give you an example. Hopefully, this is very dense. For those of you interested in the details, I'll send you the paper that's under review right now. But summarizing qualitatively, this is what this is based on. So now I'm going to show you an example using an Xcite survey from Neurosolution Geophysics from South Australia. Thanks to First Quantum for allowing to show this. So this was flown in the Adelaide Rift complex, which is a 1,000 kilometers long belt of sedimentary rocks with some volcanics. You have a combination of siltstone, sandstone, dolomite, and different things, and shales. And these shales are the most likely candidates for stratigraphic conductors. There is IP in the data, no doubt about it. Here you see positive, negatives, and then you see something starts negative and then goes positive. This is a survey area with some simple geological units overimposed. Don't ask me too much geological questions, as you gather by now, I'm a physicist. But this is what we're dealing with. And these are some of the individual IP metrics that make the core of the IP scanner. So they're not the IP scanner yet, get the building blocks of the IP scanner. So this is a map of the sum of negatives, basically. And you can already see some geological controls on this. So the stronger the colors, the more negatives you have, which doesn't mean you've got something more chargeable, but you just have more of it. This is another metric, which is basically decay rate, the tau, the taus that the contractors provide. We make our own taus at different times and everything, but at the end of the day, it does show a rate of decay. And these two can be associated with IP effects. So we take a suite of metrics associated with negatives, we take a suite of metrics associated with decay rates, we take a suite of inversions obtained without modeling IP that showed high misfits. We put it all together into matrices and we're at an optimization routine that produces this beautiful map, which this one is a map of IP scanner. So what does that mean? Anything that's dark blue doesn't have IP in it, and anything that's really red definitely 100% has got IP in it, and anything that's not dark blue most likely has got a degree of IP in it. It does, very important, it doesn't mean that where it's redder, it doesn't mean you've got more chargeable stuff, it doesn't mean it's shallower, it doesn't mean any of that. It's just telling you that in the data space, what you measure is unmistakably affected by IP. In blue means unmistakably non-affected by IP. Greens, yellows, oranges, most likely you've got a degree of IP in it, which, if not taken care of in the modeling, will give you artifacts in the resistivities. Okay, so then we actually took this the result of this IP scanner, and the client decided to have us do the IP modeling in the areas that had IP in it, as based on the IP scanner. So I'll show you these results. Okay, so this is an example of data processing. So all reds mean negative data. So this was the input data. This was the data that was edited prior to the inversion. It's not that straightforward. If you want, I can indulge later about how one processes for IP. But nonetheless, these are the input to the inversions. And now I'm going to show you first examples of results that one obtains if one does not model IP. This is a line here, and non-IP modeling, this is resistivities that one will get. Again, black line, misfit, high misfit will not fit in the data. This shading here is a depth investigation, beyond which one shouldn't basically interpret their result. So this is resistivities one doesn't model IP. This is resistivities one if one does model IP, and the difference is striking. In the next slide, I put them one on top of the other, and I'll also elaborate a little bit on what can this mean from an exploration perspective. So in the top, actually this is mislabeled right now, sorry. So the top is IP modeling and the bottom is no IP modeling in this case. So the top one is the right one. So first of all, have a look at how different the misfits are. We are fitting the data if we model IP. And then in terms of geological interpretation, if one does model IP, all of a sudden you have this D conductor in here, which is a shale, which is a relevant unit for exploration, which would have gone completely missed if one didn't model IP. Perhaps even more important from an exploration standpoint is this thin conductive layer in here, which is over-resistive, bedrock, which is a pipe. It's due to the artifact of not modeling with IP. Now, we did this work with Chris Wines at the First Quantum, and he said that if he looked at this, he would think that this could actually be a very interesting target, because it would be, I need to read what he said, it would be potentially a shell unit directly overlaying the very resistive crystallite basement, and it would be the first chemically reducing unit above basement, and as such it would make for an exploration target. But in reality, it doesn't look like that, it's like that. So all of a sudden, it doesn't have a target anymore, which is good. It saves money. From a Chargeability perspective, this is the chargeability associated with the IP corrective resistivity section we looked at earlier. And here we see the chargeability actually is fairly diffuse. And yeah, we fit the data, probably associated partly to the shale and partly to some other cover. I'll show you an example from another line, and then we're getting closer to the end. So from another line, we have the difference between non-IP modeling and IP modeling. This is probably labeled. And in here, even though the difference in terms of geometry and absolute values is still fairly large, from an expression standpoint, this is less of a material. This makes less of a material difference from an exploration standpoint. Chris wouldn't have target anything in here and another in there. From a resistivity perspective, it just having it done properly does, however, allow for a proper geological interpretation of all these units. His comment was also that by doing the IP modeling, the known fault does become more evident. What is more interesting about this section here, though, is the chargeability. The chargeability here is quite intriguing because it looks like a discrete anomaly in the hanging wall of the fault. So this does become significant in terms of an exploration model. You could have hydrothermal fluids traveling up along the fault, carrying metals, etc. So this does make for an intriguing target. I don't know if you were able to drill it. It hasn't been drilled yet. Right, now, as I said earlier, we need to compare the chargeability that is recovered through our modeling, compare it against the airborne IP scan and map that we have produced. And this is what this map is about. So again, I show you the chargeability obtained whilst inverting against the value of that airborne IP scanner grid that I first showed you in plan view. So all I did was sample the value of that grid and project it across this this section here. And what this is showing is that the IP scanner actually did show highs where when one does go and invert for chargeability, he would recover a strong chargeable anomaly, which is reassuring. It's basically stating that the final point of the workflow of the airborne IP scanner, this one here, point number 8, was actually satisfied. Yes, inverted chargeability does have good spatial correspondence with the airborne IP scanner grid, which we had used to base our judgment about, about where IP was present. So I've come to the conclusion. So IP effects are present in the airborne data more often than what do you think? And this push towards lower base frequencies, higher signal to noise ratio systems will only make the presence of IP in the data more and more pervasive, because we're going towards having better data at later times. And if you recall, IP effects take time to develop and overcome the eddy currents. So we're going to see more and more. The other reason why we're going to see more is that the industry, the contractors have now accepted that this is real, so they don't try to get rid of it. So it's a given in my view, IP is there and will be there. Now, once it's in there, it always represents either an opportunity or a problem, and it's up to whoever carries out the exploration to make that call. So if you don't deal with that, your resistivities will be wrong. In the fact that they can't be right, they simply cannot be right, and they can be wrong down to depth. And on top of it, you throw away free, quote unquote, extra physical properties, the chargeability that you can use for interpretation. If you deal with them, the resistivities will be right. I'm not saying they always will be, but they can be right. They do stand a chance of being right. And you also have an extra complementary parameter for exploration. Now, water caution is about the airborne IP maps from contractors. Contractors have started selling basically IP maps or AI IP maps. You may have seen some from Geotech. CGG also does some of it. Xcite doesn't do anything at this stage. I don't know about Spectrum, even though I doubt it, being fixed link, it's much harder. So in my view, what they produce is exceedingly oversimplified and produces both false positives and false negatives in terms of where you really have IP effects. Because if they only plot negatives, they are not taking into account all sorts of other distortions. If they do something very fast, it simply, in my view, is based on must be based on very dangerous assumptions. What we do is rigorous. It is a very rigorous blend of data space and model space. Takes a week to do, not 2 minutes, okay? In my view, robust assessment of airborne IP effects should be carried out routinely on each and every airborne EM dataset, both new and old. Just imagine places like Australia, Canada, where they've got these wealth of open file data that have never been looked at in terms of IP. I'm not saying you should go and model the hell out of it with IP, but at least you could go and run an airborne IP scanner on each of them, and that you would know if the conclusion that anyone had come to based on the use of the airborne EM that was done back then, whether they were sound or they had to be flawed because the IP effect hadn't been taken into account. In our view, the airborne IP scanner presented today is robust. Way of doing it is relatively fast and cost efficient. As I said, it takes about a week to do a proper job because we have to go between data and model space robustly a number of times. But the point is that given that actually carrying out the airborne IP modeling per se, inverting for cold call is very expensive and can be counterproductive if you do it where you shouldn't, this tool allows you to know where you should do it. And then you can make a call whether you do want to do it or you don't. And I think I'm done. I'm very happy to take questions. I would like to thank SAGA, Steph, and Oleg for the invite, Chris Wans for a First Quantum for sharing the data. There is the exploration geophysics paper under review. Some of this work was performed by a master student I'm supervising from University of Pisa, Francesco Daud, so thanks to him as well. And some of this work was also funded through the INFACT project, so thanks to those as well. Hopefully you're not all asleep. I'm very happy to take questions if there are any. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andrea. I've got a comment here from Stefan from De Beers saying, excellent work and contribution to modern geophysics. Well done. So I think that sums up our appreciation for the talk. I've got about 4 questions, so please send some more through if you would like. Sue sent one quite early on. So Sue was saying a general question inspired by slide number 6.
Yes.
Okay, she asked, are there any airborne test sites that show the AIP response?
We're working on that in Europe at the moment. As I said, you've seen this logo here, this INFACT logo. I encourage you all to look it up. It is a Horizon 2020 project I'm part of, and we've got 4 sites across Europe where we've flown everything. 2 of them in Spain, in the Pirate Belt. So there's Rio Tinto and Copper Truths. In both cases, we've got measurable IP effects, and we've got a feel for where the IP is coming from. In both cases, a lot of it has to do with tailing dams minerals that have been core there for a lot of time. So that is the only thing that qualifies as a test site as such. There are a number of examples that work we've done. If you got time, and I can show you examples over a Tiklo Chai, which is a kimberlite in Canada where we have our own inversion result again compared against the lab-based cold call models done on the core, and they are close, I would say. So I hope that addresses Sue's question.
Hopefully, Sue, let us know if not. And there was a question also early on from Louis Polomé saying, does system geometry affect the amount of the AIP response?
Yes, as he knows. Now, the response of the ground, yes, in the sense that the higher you go, the less IP effects are going to see. Measured by IP effects are going to see. IP has got a very, very strong dependency on flying height, much more than if you don't have IP. So it will be harder to pull out IP effects if one flies higher, which could be a pro if one didn't want to see IP effects in the data. But if you do want to get it out, it will be harder. But as he knows, there is a lot of work to be done on fixed wing data. Of course, you can get in an offset geometry, you can get negatives without calling upon IP simply because of geometry. So that can also make things more complicated. All you've seen here was based on helicopter central loop systems, just because it's so much easier to understand what's going on and to try to pull it all out.
Okay, great. The next question kind of links in with that. It's from Naraka. I think Naraka is still at Spectrum. It says, can you say why helicopter systems appear to be more affected or sensitive to IP while fixed wing systems are not? And she says, great talk. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Naraka, it's basically what I said, you know, altitude plays a big role. And I have a feeling that also in a fixed wing system, you have more unknown parameters, basically, most of the times. You only just now on some systems start to record the actual position of the bird or of the coil itself within the bird. So if you don't know this, it's going to be very hard to tell apart IP-based distortions from rotation of the bird kind of distortions. So I do have a feel that part of the reason why we see less, we think we see less, because it's harder to tell them apart, and it's also harder not to butcher them in pre-processing, I believe.
Thanks. A similar question from Eric. I'm not sure where you're from, Eric. It says, IP is notoriously difficult to identify, at least for fixed wing aircraft systems, unless you have very low TX base frequencies. How can it be confirmed that these identified IP effects are not artifacts as a result of the system or processing / filtering methodologies? Yeah,
well, he's right. If he's referring to fixed wing system with an offset geometry configuration, of course. But these were all central loop helicopter EM examples. So apologies, I should have mentioned that. We have done 2 or 3 attempts on fixed wing data, and I do believe there was IP in there, but I didn't dare to show because it is still very shaky, and we need to do much more work on synthetics. I mean, the reason why I'm game enough to show this stuff is that behind this, there is something like 500,000 4 responses that we've run on a helicopter EM configuration, all sorts of different layers, different altitude. So we know when IP can legitimately be present in the data. So we actually recognize it. But of course, there can be issues of, you know, if you take off too much self-response from the system, to some degree, that can look like IP effect too. So yeah, there's still work to do.
Okay, thanks. So Jaco Smit asks, some of the effects you model as IP with respect to a layered Earth model can also be explained by a 3D geoelectrical model. Is this correct?
That is correct. The only thing you cannot explain with calling just upon 3D is a sign change. So that is definitely correct. Thanks, Jaco. I think it was written somewhere in my slides, and I definitely, of course, there is a possibility that in places we are fitting with chargeability something that's 3D. That's a possibility. I would argue the opposite can also occur. How many times have somebody fit with 3D something that in reality was chargeability? So the fact is that whenever we go into IP, we will not get into IP modeling unless we are sure they're not just 3D effects. So you look for negatives, or you look for distortions in transients which cover large areas. I didn't dwell on it. In the IP scanner, we actually have one important step of the scanner is making sure that the distortions we are assigning to IP are actually not related to 3D effect. So yeah, very fair point.
And then the last two are not questions, more comments. So Stefan's from De Beers says that they've also found that depths to conductors are very accurate after AIP correction and inversion, with totally wrong depths or conductors prior to the correction. Do you know of any incorrect drilling that was done due to not correcting for AIP?
Well, you hardly get to know about those, do you? Look, I don't know. No, the short answer is no. I should also say that I can't show many spectacular results of somebody that drilled an IP anomaly and got a disseminated sulfide or massive sulfide. The only drillings that I was made aware of that were done based on our work at depth that actually hit something chargeable. It was there, it was chargeable, but it wasn't what they were after. But it did show something chargeable because they actually did the chargeability on the core. Unfortunately, we'll go down the history as technical success kind of thing. I do know of other success stories in somewhere in a tropical country where they actually did drill a chargeable anomaly. We had a model and they did find disseminated sulfides. They did. One comment there from the client was that, however, the highest chargeable anomaly was a little bit offset from the highest concentration of the mineralization, which makes sense. As I said earlier, we are looking at different frequencies. So most of this stuff I've seen, whenever I was given ancillary information to compare our results against, made me think that an airborne-based chargeability section actually targets alterations more than mineralization. So, but nonetheless, it was useful. I mean, UTM X and Y, it was in the right position, but the good stuff was a little bit deeper than what the chargeability maximum actually showed.
Okay, and sorry, now I've lost the thing. Oleg also said great talk and agreed that in South Africa we have a wealth of data which can be re-evaluated for potentially missed targets due to masking by AIP effects. So if you ever get bored, we've got some spare data for you.
It's not about getting bored, it's about actually, as organized, putting some resources onto this, but I don't know if there are any other questions. Otherwise, I can have a concluding remark.
Yeah, that's it. So I will now don't run away after Andrea's concluding remark. I'm going to post now also the link to the Google Hangout after this, if you would like to go and seem trendy and young and go hang out with your friends on Google Hangout. So yes, concluding remark would be great.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Stephanie. Well, again, thanks for being here and for allowing me to be here. Basically, the bottom line is, the industry has spent dozens and dozens of millions, hundreds of millions worldwide to acquire airborne data to get conductivities. And then explore based on that, or to get voltages and explore based on voltages. Now, I think there is a widespread acknowledgement in this industry that IP effects are real and they can actually mess up with both your resistivities and your voltages if you don't deal with them. So in my view, it would make a lot of sense to invest an extra very small portion of what was originally invested for flying it and run this scanner on very large scale regions and projects. And then you would know whether perhaps you may want to look at that again, or there is no need because there was no IP effect to begin with. Hence, whatever conclusion had been drawn back then, it was sound from that perspective. One thing I didn't say is that, talking about voltages, now, what I showed you now is correcting IP effects in the model space. What one can do, and some clients ask me to do that, is then reinstate the voltages as they would have been if there was nothing chargeable. And that can be done. Why is that a good thing? Because if you do that, then you can take that IP strip voltages and put it into whatever code you want, because there's way more codes that deal with non-dispersive resistivity. Or you can better interpret directly on the voltages. Of course, there is a caveat of 3D versus 1D, but there's definitely a lot of good reasons, in my view, also to do that. And with this, I'll shut up and thank you again.
No, thank you very much, Andrea. I'm truly sorry we can't clap out loud. I should actually have like a sound bite of clapping and hand over a bottle of wine to you. We'll have to keep that for the next SAGA conference to make up for it. But thank you for all of your time and effort for this talk, and go have a good day and a good evening and a good weekend.